Hi everyone, welcome to Maxwell Chambers. For those who have never been here before, I'm going to keep my remarks really short because there's actually two other people after me, but we're really proud to be able to work with ITA and SIAC to host this series of very distinguished interviews. So without further ado, let me hand over to Kevin from SIAC who will take you through a bit more detail about this.
Good morning, everyone. I will be equally brief, and I would just like to say that we are so happy to be able to be a part of this event with ITA and to welcome ITA to Singapore in this beautiful setting at Maxwell Chambers. And for our part, this is an oral history interview, but for everyone in Singapore, everyone in arbitration, we are very familiar with Dr. Hwang, who is one of the doyens of arbitration. So we all know the history, particularly at the institutions, but to have two of Singapore's very best participating in this project. So we are very pleased. So thank you to everyone. Great to be around friends and colleagues on this important day.
Thank you very much, and good morning. My name is Krina Baltag. I'm a professor in international arbitration at Stockholm University. I am the vice chair of the ITA Academic Council, the Institute for Transnational Arbitration, and I'm the chair of the Oral History Project. The Preserving Perspective Project's International Arbitrators in Their Own Words, as we call it in full, is a series of recorded interviews with leading arbitration practitioners, telling us the story of the modern arbitration as they created it. This project was the brainchild of the late, great Professor David Caron, and we have conducted over 20 interviews in the past 10 years, including with Lucy Reed here with us. I have to say that we are truly grateful and we appreciate Michael Hwang and Chuan Thye being here with us today, as well as the support of SIAC and Maxwell Chambers. I have the privilege of briefly introducing Chuan Thye, because obviously Dr. Michael Hwang will be duly introduced during the interview. And as you all know, Chuan Thye is the partner at Rajah & Tann in Singapore, a senior counsel of the Supreme Court of Singapore, and a fellow of the Chartered Institute of Arbitrators. Chuan Thye has been recognized as a leading arbitration practitioner, as well as a leading arbitrator on the list of various international arbitration institutions, including SIAC. Chuan Thye is also recognized as a leading practitioner in restructuring and insolvency. Without further ado, I would like to thank again SIAC and Maxwell Chambers. Thank you, Kevin. Thank you, Lucy. Everybody at Maxwell Chambers. Chuan Thye and Michael, the floor is yours.
Good morning, everyone. I'm going to start by doing what counsel calls reading into the record. This is known, but we're putting this down for posterity, so to speak. Michael's first interaction with the ITA was in 1999, when he participated in a simulated international arbitration workshop in Dallas, in Texas. He went on then to serve as an executive committee member of the advisory board from 2002 to 2008. What led to this was, firstly, time at Pembroke at Oxford, where he took not just the BA, but also the BCL. He then went on to teach for a year at Sydney University in Australia. And in recognition of that, the university in 2014 conferred on him honorary LLD. He then came back to Singapore and unusually in these times, spent some 35 years there from 1968 to 2002. In that period, he spent 18 months as a judicial commissioner on the High Court of Singapore. That was 1991 to 1992. And in 1998, became a member of ICA, the International Council of Commercial Arbitration. This was at a time when ICA membership was limited. and the total in number are only 33. I think someone has described ICA as being the House of Cardinals in international arbitration. And Michael was vice president of ICA from 2002 to 2010. He served also as commissioner on the United Nations Compensation Commission in Geneva from 2000 to 2003, was president of the Law Society here in Singapore from 2008 to 2010. Spreading out, he was Deputy Chief Justice of the Dubai International Financial Center Courts from 2005 to 2010, and then Chief Justice from 2010 to 2018. And Michael, as we all know, after leaving Allen & Gladhill in 2002, has been an independent arbitrator, recognized by appointments to the ICC Court of Arbitration and an active member of the IBA Arbitration Committee. Michael, this is without question a stellar CV. Perhaps we can use our time today to understand what has motivated you and keeps you motivated. I begin, if I may, with an award you received from the Law Society of Singapore. You had served, as I've said before, a president from 2008 to 2010. The award is known as the C.C. Tan Award, conferred on an individual who has, in his professional life, embodied and exemplified the virtues of honesty, fair play, and personal integrity. In your acceptance speech, you said you remembered being asked when you first started practice what kind of honors you were aiming for, and you had replied that you were, and I quote, looking for honor rather than honors. And all I wanted was to be held in high esteem by my peers for the quality of my work and the integrity of my conduct. That was in 2012, 50 years on from your first year as an undergraduate at Oxford University. The 35 years that you spent at Allen & Gladhill saw the firm growing from 9 lawyers to over 120 lawyers. And you left just after the firm celebrated its centenary. So you had been there for more than a third of its existence. So by any measure, even by that point, it was a hugely successful legal career. So first question is, what prompted you in the 1990s to take on the challenge of international arbitration? Singapore's legislation in the area was passed only in 1989.
International arbitration in Singapore actually was born more or less around the time that I was on the bench. And therefore, I had a preview as a judge of learning what the government's plans were for arbitration in Singapore. So when the SIAC was established, I was on not exactly the board, but I think there was a panel of advisors under the then head of the SIAC, the former Attorney General Tan Boon Teck. And so I was in at the start of the SIAC. And when I came back to my old firm after finishing my stint on the bench as judicial commissioner, my managing partner then said, things have changed since you left. You used to be a generalist. Now we want everybody to be specialists. So we decided that you will head up our disputes department, litigation, and take this new development of international arbitration seriously, because you are well poised to make your mark in that field. So I took him at his word and set about it methodically, learning the A's and B's of international arbitration, and not just relying on the fact that I had been serving on a bench and therefore had a sense of entitlement to be chosen as arbitrator for international disputes.
I'm going to risk the wrath of Kevin Nash for the next question. By the 1990s, Hong Kong had produced several recognized names in the arbitration world, names like Neil Kaplan, Teresa Ching, Sally Harpo, and Philip Young. How did they receive your efforts?
all of these people were my mentors. In those days, Singaporeans had to learn their arbitration from the Hong Kongers, because Hong Kong had a 10-year head start on Singapore. And as I said, I had to start at the bottom of the arbitration tree, signed up for CIR courses, parts 1 and parts 2 and so on. And the CIR sent the people that Chuan Thye mentioned to Singapore to take those courses. So I got to know them quite well. And in turn, they ran courses in Hong Kong as well. So I would go to Hong Kong and get further instruction from these people who then became my friends and mentors.
I think the assumption from your appointment as judicial commissioner is that your practice had been largely in litigation in the courts. Would that have been a correct assumption?
No, before I went to the bench, I actually had a very wide practice. I was a generalist, but broadly speaking, my practice divided into 3 parts. I started life as a nuts and bolts company lawyer, and then I moved on to corporate finance. So about 1/3 of my work was what we used to call corporate finance, which is basically M&A work and other corporate deals, banking as well. And I was doing the sweat of daily banking documents for loans and the beginnings of syndicated loans. Then from there, I developed also a conveyancing practice and started acting for developers and at the high end of dealing with sale of office buildings, hotels, and major buildings, as well as routine conveyancing. And then in the midst of all this, I said to my boss, who then ran the company law practice, the senior partner, you know, all of this work looking at your M&A, memorandum and articles, not mergers and acquisitions, you know, I actually don't see a lot of human beings. I need to relate to some human activity. So what did I get? Running down cases. But that taught me a lot of lessons. I learned my criminal law from defending taxi drivers. And I did the whole range. So about another 1/3 of my work was in litigation. And I sort of really matured in my litigation practice in the first Asian financial crisis. And everyone was running to courts to get, that was when the Mareva injunction was born in Singapore. And I was among those who, you know, was working at that kind of level. But there are not a lot of judgments that bear my name as counsel up to the time that I became a JC. I did a study, and most of it came after I came back from the court, when I really was told to specialize in litigation.
And in the new sort of adventure into arbitration, did this whiff of practice get in the way, or did it help?
No, I think it was enormously helpful, particularly for corporate disputes. When I did solicitors' work, in the old days, many solicitors in Singapore just blindly followed the forms that their firms had, not really understanding what the technical phrases meant. I made it a point to understand every legal term, every legal doctrine that was covered by our precedents. And I even, you were told, go and look at Butterworth's precedents. Fine, you take the Butterworth precedent, and then you look at the commentary to understand why certain wordings are used and what particular legal areas they were supposed to reflect. So you understand that background, you understand the mind of the drafter, you understand rules of drafting, and that helps a lot when you come to analyze commercial documents and interpret contracts.
And in the 90s, did being Asian help or hinder your entry into the world of international arbitration?
At that time, the market was ripe for entry into the market of arbitrators from neutral countries. And Asia was as good a region for neutral arbitrators. And within Asia, of course, Singapore had the advantage that we have a very high proportion of people whose first language is English, which of course is the language of international arbitration. So we had that inherent advantage. And maybe you want to ask me about the position of Singapore in the context of Asia.
And would you elaborate on that?
If you are Singaporean and people are looking around for someone to be on a panel, being Singaporean creates what I call a halo effect. You know, automatically, if you say you're Singaporean, then people look at this imaginary halo and says, right, you're Singaporean. Singaporeans are all extremely well educated. They're very good in English. They're very intelligent, and they're up there, you know, with the latest trends. Point one. Point two, for many people, almost as important, Singaporeans are known not to be corrupt. So I think those were the two major things. And regardless of who I was, I had that inbuilt advantage.
And not so much about arbitrators, but more about counsel. Do you have any views on how ethical standards in arbitration can be maintained or should be maintained?
That's a subject for a lecture I'm giving in a couple of weeks' time about guerrilla tactics. It's a major subject, and I've written quite a lot on it. And I have strong views, mainly that my original view was that actually management of counsel ethics has to be handled at the institutional level, which means the institutions who are administering arbitrations. But clearly, institutions have no appetite for this. So there was a move to create an international disciplinary organization, which the Swiss Arbitration Association propagated, but that didn't find much favor either. So, you know, we are still trying to think of a method. And my simple answer is the easiest way to deal with it is to allow complaints to be made about counsel misconduct to their bar counsel. And that's the short and simple way. All you need to do is to change institutional rules to allow an exception to confidentiality to enable that to be done. That's the short answer.
And we look forward to the longer version in the lectures. The progression from private practice to commercial arbitration can be, I guess, somewhat logical. But was there anything in your experience that prepared you to become an arbitrator in cases on international investment law? I mean, at last count, you had about 18 matters where you have been on the tribunal.
Quite a few of those 18 were cases against states by commercial parties. So in those cases, it's not very different from other commercial institutions, except that once a state is involved, you always get a certain amount of delay because states take a long time to give instructions. And this is exaggerated when it's investment treaty cases. The way that an emerging arbitrator gets into the investment treaty market is really that they make a name for themselves in commercial arbitration. And then the institutions who administer treaty arbitrations then are on the lookout for new entrants into the market and then bring them on into the simpler cases so that they can cut their teeth on real work, usually in a panel of 3 somewhere. And then they learn from the seniors and then they move on to develop their own path in that field.
One issue that comes up, or is perhaps a hot potato in investment treaty cases, is the question of whether a tribunal ought to be raising possible corruption issues. Are there different considerations in investment treaty arbitration and commercial arbitration?
In theory, no. In practice, yes. Because the power to investigate corruption by a tribunal comes from the same source. It's the inherent power of a tribunal not to assist in criminal activity. But interestingly, there's no unanimity of this. I'm currently on a task force of the ICC Commission on corruption, and it's a huge effort with a membership of over 100. And, we've got 10 tracks going on separate aspects of the problem. And one of them, which I'm on, is the question of the issue of whether tribunals should voluntarily take on the task of investigating corruption. Again, I've written stuff on it, and I don't want to elaborate on this for too long. But it was interesting that working with my own panel, another common lawyer and another continental lawyer, both of them were a little reserved about this idea of tribunals taking on the challenge of independently investigating corruption if they were not in the pleadings or in the prepared case of the parties. And I'll just tell you one example. I mean, the leading example of a treaty tribunal in independently investigating corruption is Metaltech against Uzbekistan. And so when I raised this at a conference in London, two people immediately disagreed with me that it was such a duty. One was the then head of 20 Essex Chambers, so you can, one of the top barristers in the country, and said, this is the slippery slope. This is the beginning of the slippery slope. Once you start, you don't know where to stop, and things get out of control. A very senior solicitor stood up and said, Metaltech against Uzbekistan is different because it's treaty. And, he was talking about commercial arbitration. He said, with treaty arbitrations, there's a international public policy because a state cannot tolerate corruption, and there's a public interest in maintaining that, as opposed to commercial arbitration, apparently, when tribunals are not concerned about criminal activity being indirectly sanctioned by a tribunal. So it's a bit of an anomaly.
So a watchdog as opposed to a bloodhound?
Therein lies the tale. I'm at this conference in London talking about power over tribunals to investigate. And somebody asked me the question from the floor. And I just instinctively reacted as a Singaporean. Why Singaporean? Because there was a very famous case many years ago when one of our leading companies' CEO was convicted of fraudulently messing up the accounts of the company. And so the question was made against the auditors, why didn't you pick this up? And the auditors' answer then, and I think even now, is auditors are watchdogs, not bloodhounds. So that popped into my mind, and I said, no, a tribunal is normally only a watchdog and not a bloodhound. After the conference, GAR, Global Arbitration Review, came up to me and said, we're going to make this a story. Look out for it. So I'm there eagerly opening the next issue. And on the cover page, there it was. Watchdogs or bloodhounds. Unfortunately, it was not my picture on the cover. It was a picture of two bloodhounds.
Let's move on a little bit and talk about things, innovations. You've never been content with the status quo. And you're known, in your own words, to be a passionate supporter of the extension of witness conferencing from expert witnesses to the evidence of factual witnesses, at least in some instances. And when you were Chief Justice of the IFC, you initiated and saw through a court protocol whereby enforcement of the IFC judgments would be more effectively enforced internationally by a process of arbitration. Then During your tenure, there were various memoranda of understanding which entered into with the courts of England, Australia, and Singapore. Where does this energy, this desire to constantly improve come from?
Well, that's the difference between being an arbitrator and the Chief Justice of a court. The arbitrator is in control of the proceedings, but when you are on a panel, then your ability to innovate is limited by what your co-arbitrators will agree to. So some of them get a bit conservative. So that's why I like doing sole arbitrations, because then I can, I just negotiate it with the council. And particularly if I'm dealing with local council, it's much easier to discuss these things with people who know you and I know them, and we can work out something, from a common, how shall I put it, legal heritage, which doesn't make it too difficult. Because I have this idea sometimes that where there's nothing in writing within the rules of the institution, we can always draw on the accumulated historical experience of the courts and adapt them where they can fill gaps in the arbitral procedure. And then when you get to being Chief Justice, then of course, I have the power to initiate reforms, which I did. Some of them still are there in the records, not often used sometimes, but there we are. At least there are things that I know that I've done, and hopefully some people will realize their utility in due course.
The IFC courts were new or relatively new. And how much room did you have to innovate?
We had a lot of room in the DIFC. I mean, say what you like. The DIFC is an amazing institution. It was meant to create, as it were, a home away for home for foreign investors. So they wanted to create a geographical area where you could come in and think that you were in London, New York, Sydney, or Singapore, or Hong Kong, as any other financial center. So we had this unique creation of what I called a common law island in an ocean of civil law countries. And we had actual full independence by our statute, which said that if anything happened within our district, it was within our jurisdiction. And there was an even more significant clause which said that any company which is incorporated in the DIFC and they make a contract with other parties, then those contracts are automatically subject to the jurisdiction of the DIFC court. So we had a very wide remit. And then, of course, there was voluntary submission, which was slow at the beginning, but now it's actually significantly increasing year after year, not only from within the UAE, but from outside.
Do you have any sort of particular favorites of innovations or ideas that you introduced that you might want to talk about?
The first idea, which was novel, and I don't want to spend too much time on it because it's slightly complex, but in short, the idea was to try and give the benefits of arbitration to enhance enforcement of court judgments by making use of the New York Convention to enable court judgments to be enforced in the New York Convention countries instead of those countries which had mutual recognition treaties or laws for recognition of foreign judgments. So the idea was to get parties, when negotiating their contracts, to add a clause to say that whoever wins the case has the right and the option to, there's a precondition. You get a judgment, and before the judgment, we have agreed that if there is a dispute about the enforcement of the judgment, you can take that to arbitration. So you write it in a separate arbitration clause to enable enforcement of the judgment if there is a dispute. And for this purpose, failure to pay amounts to a dispute. Now, the legal criticism of that clause was that it was a unilateral right of arbitration. Only the winner can invoke the arbitration clause, not the loser. But at least in common law countries, we actually have case law authority to say that unilateral arbitration clauses are enforceable. In civil law countries, this was a bit doubtful, but my last research about 2 years ago showed that there is a Paris case which involved the Apple Corporation, where they have also recognized a unilateral arbitration clause as lawful. So the theory of it is fine. You just have to get people to work on it. So the other one that I think has a wider appeal in arbitration is this terrible system the world over of reporting arbitration cases in court by anonymizing them. And everybody is so uninspired as to use alphabets. Now, for a start, you have a conflict with family law cases which are also anonymized and also use alphabets. And for this particular solution, I have to thank my good wife. I decided that we were going to get out of this anonymization in Dubai, in the DIFC. So I said, we'll have a prize for the staff as to who comes up with the best system. So they all said, okay, let's use all sorts of methods. The first suggestion was, why don't we use a famous novel with many, many characters in it? And what about Lord of the Rings? I said, I'm sorry, Singapore has already taken that, because some of you will know that there is a judgment of Vinod Kumarasamy, where there were so many characters in the case, he decided to adopt the Lord of the Rings. So I said, that's taken already. So then they all came up with all sorts of suggestions, but I said, you keep on coming up with Anglo-Saxon names. We are in the Middle East. Let's have something, more universal. My good wife says, try babynames.com. And indeed, there's a plethora of names, and they are very international, very, not associated with particular countries, and they've adopted it. And on top of that, the cherry on the ice cream is that we do it in a very logical way. The year we started, all cases were reported using the alphabet A. So you can tell straight away the age of the case. When I started it, it was A. We are now up to L.
Let's come back to one of the things that you are quite keen on, and this is witness conferencing of factual witnesses. It's, I think, an area that the courts have followed. The courts have followed arbitration, certainly for expert witness conferencing. But you're an advocate for factual witness conferencing. Isn't there a concern, at least from counsel brought up in the common law tradition, that this is a due process issue?
First of all, let me explain factual witness conferencing. Generally, it only works if you can bifurcate or trifurcate. In other words, the factual witness conferencing is helpful for a very complex case, but with discrete issues to be decided. And typically, those are construction cases. So each sector, which is of the construction, which is under dispute, can be segregated into a separate mini trial. And that's when you break it up into separate segments of the entire arbitration. And what you want to do is to say, right, on day one, we will handle all the complaints about the roof. Everybody who said anything about the defective roof in their witness statements, you turn up and we will have a mass cross-examination of everyone. And when the lawyers complain, I said, look, think of it this way. Do you like classical music? Think of yourself as the conductor of an orchestra. So you point to A and said, well, what's your answer to this? And then you turn to X and say, and what's your reply? And then the other counsel does the same. And then they all get into the swing of things and they all enjoy themselves with this. Right? So that's what I'm trying to talk about. So, but sometimes there is one critical issue, because really, everybody is contributing to the pool of knowledge about that particular issue from a different viewpoint. Now, sometimes as an issue, there's a really serious argument between two people about what happened in a certain incident. And he says, I need to cross-examine this person independently without anybody being around. I said, fine, you segregate that part of it as well. And for that, we will tell people not to ask any questions about that particular issue. And we will have a separate issue and bring the two of them who are involved in that dispute to come together and have an argument face-to-face. The actual protagonists of two sides of a factual question can be cross-examined at the same time, apart from everybody else.
This ability to adapt procedures, is this influenced by your familiarity with court rules and procedure when you bring this to arbitration?
Oh, indeed. One of the problems about arbitration pleadings is that they get enormously long. I mean, when we all started in litigation, we were encouraged to state the bare minimum. They're very skeletal. And so, of course, arbitration is an improvement on that because you get to know the full case much earlier. But the trouble is, when you do a very full pleading, and the pleading goes into 100 pages or more, sometimes you don't see the forest for the trees. And so the respondent looks at it and says, but what actually is the key issue that he is trying to make in order to justify his claim for liability and damages? And we do not have a recognized technique in arbitration to deal with clarifications of your pleadings. So whereas in litigation, every first thing you learn about pleading is a request for further and better particulars. And you identify where is the contract made and who were the parties to it, and was it in writing, partly in writing, and so on. So there's no reason why you can't say, well, yes, we've got a lot of information, but we need to know certain other key information which is missing, and you make an order for that. And actually in arbitration, there is actually a term for it in some quarters, and they call it a request for further information. And again, you can always order that.
So, from your experience then, a young lawyer wanting a career in international arbitration, what would your advice be to him or her? Would spend some time in litigation first? Not?
I'm a firm believer that a litigation grounding is an advantage for somebody who wants to go into arbitration as a counsel. I mean, you have to go into arbitration as a counsel unless you are somebody like a law professor, and then you're put onto tribunals for your expertise in a particular subject. So for the youngsters, if they go into a law firm, they'll go into big cases right away, but they will go in as fourth or fifth or sixth chair. One of my interns who from India called me recently and told me, my first case on international arbitration, I was chair number 27. That shows you how many lawyers the Indians can throw into a case. And at chair 27, there's a limit to how much you can learn. Whereas if you go into a litigation practice and at least the firm has some small cases to do, then you cut your teeth on that. I mean, like I served my apprenticeship. I did my debt collection. I did my running down cases. I did my, petty crime cases. So you learn techniques which are necessary when you become a trial advocate, whether it's a trial in court or a trial in an arbitration. And those will always serve you well. Now, of course, there are excessive procedures that you learn in litigation, which you will not necessarily have the ability or the need to use in arbitration. And you may rejoice in the fact that you can ask for hearsay evidence or make leading questions, but you will still get cut off by some arbitrators when the question is really too leading, or you're asking about second or third hand hearsay. So what the litigator turned arbitration lawyer, arbitration advocate has to do in those circumstances is to shed the excess learning that he has acquired from a litigation background. It's much easier that way than for somebody who starts in arbitration and then goes back into a local firm and then has to adapt and understand court procedures.
Michael, there really isn't sufficient time today to do the full breadth of your views on international arbitration and dispute resolution justice. But thankfully, you've published 2 substantial collections of essays in 2013 and 2018, and we can look at those and turn to those. And you continue to think, write, and publish. To mention a couple, you have a model procedural order on establishing a confidentiality regime, and that's been published in Nathan O'Malley's book on rules of evidence in international arbitration. And you have a chapter on a protocol for hot tubbing of factual witnesses in a publication called Liber Amicorum for Michael Moser. And you're sufficiently concerned about the future of arbitration to advocate, as you have done today, for international arbitration institutions to have a code of conduct for counsel. And you've said, modestly, and I quote, "I have no illusions about any of these innovations being adopted as, with the possible exception of the Redfern schedule, no innovation proposed by an individual practitioner or academic, however distinguished the proposer and however good the innovation, has been widely adopted." Yet, since 2003, you have personally trained and supervised a group of young practitioners, some no longer so young, who have branched out and spread out geographically, many of whom will make their own contributions. This MH alumni will witness to the mark you have made in our little corner of the professional world and the values that have shaped you. Before I close and thank you for this morning, you have the last word.
Oh. My last word actually is to thank Chuan Thye for having done the research and for conducting this interview for me. Let me just give you a word of background. He mentioned that there were 9 lawyers in Alan and Gretel when I joined them in 1968. I was number 9. Chuan Thye's father was number 8. So Chuan Thye's father was my mentor within the firm before he left to set up his own firm. Chuan Thye went to Oxford and got a considerably better degree than I did. So of course we took him on when he came back and joined Alan and Gretel as my pupil. When I went to the High Court, he coincidentally or otherwise also came to the High Court with me as a Justice's Law Clerk, one of the early ones. And when I went back to the firm, he also rejoined me in the firm. So we go back a long way. And my thanks to him again for contributing to today's seminar.
Thank you, Michael, for this morning. Thank you, everyone, for being present.